You can eat a balanced diet, take your daily multivitamin, spend time outside when the weather allows, and feel completely fine. While your immune system is operating at half capacity, your muscles are quietly losing their structural anchors, and something is actively accelerating the aging of every cell in your body. Right now. Not in theory, not eventually. Right now, as you watch this, that is what a silent vitamin D deficiency looks like at 60, 70, and beyond. And the reason most people don't catch it isn't negligence. It's a measurement problem, specifically a gap between what your lab report calls normal and what the research actually shows your body needs to function. I'm going to walk you through that gap, layer by layer, starting at your skin and ending at your brain. And by the end of this, I'll give you what I call the solar debt protocol. 3 specific corrections that address this deficiency at every stage of its biology, not just one. Stay with me because the most important part isn't the deficiency itself. It's the reason the standard blood test misses it even when you're already dangerously low. Let me start with what vitamin D actually is, because most people have this wrong in a way that changes everything. It is not a vitamin, not in the functional sense. A vitamin is a compound you must obtain from food because your body cannot synthesize it. Vitamin D is manufactured in your skin from sunlight, then it travels to your liver, then to your kidneys, then it circulates through your entire body and binds to receptors inside the nucleus of your cells, where it behaves exactly like a hormone. It controls gene expression. It tells cells what to do, when to divide, when to stop dividing, when to die. Calling it a vitamin is like calling testosterone a mineral. The classification is technically historical, not biological. And that misclassification has had real consequences, because if it's a vitamin, you assume a little from your multivitamin is probably fine. If it's a hormone, which it is, the conversation becomes completely different. A hormone deficiency is a systemic crisis, not a nutritional footnote. The framing determines how urgently you treat it. Now let me strip away the first layer and show you what's actually happening. When ultraviolet B radiation from sunlight hits your skin, it converts a molecule called 7-dehydrocholesterol, a cholesterol precursor sitting just below the skin's surface, into previtamin D3. That previtamin D3 is structurally unstable. Within hours, it isomerizes into vitamin D3, also called cholecholesterol, which enters your bloodstream and begins a journey through 2 separate organ systems before it becomes anything your body can actually use. This is where the process begins. And this is also where aging delivers its first blow, quietly, without any symptom you would notice. By the time you reach age 70, your skin produces approximately 75% less vitamin D from identical sun exposure compared to a 20-year-old. Not slightly less, 75% less. Research by Michael Holick at Boston University, one of the foremost vitamin D researchers in the world, established that a 70-year-old standing in the same afternoon sunlight as a 20-year-old walks away with roughly a quarter of the vitamin D that younger persons synthesized. The reason is straightforward. The concentration of 7-dehydrocholesterol in aging skin drops dramatically, and even when the sunlight conditions are perfect, angle, duration, season, cloud cover, there is very little raw material left in the skin to convert. The machine is still running. The factory floor is almost empty. This matters because the cultural narrative around vitamin D is almost entirely sun-based. Get outside, enjoy the afternoon light, you'll be fine. That advice was built on the biology of a 30-year-old. In the skin of a 65-year-old, the same sun exposure generates a fraction of the result. If you are over 60 and relying on daily outdoor time to maintain your vitamin D, you are working with broken equipment and no warning light, and the skin layer is only the beginning. Because what enters your bloodstream after sun exposure, raw vitamin D3, is completely inert. It cannot bind to cell receptors. It cannot regulate any gene. It cannot touch your bones, your immune cells, your brain, or your arteries. It has to be converted twice by 2 separate organs, and both of those organs age in ways that compromise exactly that conversion. The first conversion happens in your liver. Your liver takes raw D3 from the bloodstream and converts it into a compound called 25-hydroxyvitamin D, typically abbreviated as 25-OHD. This is the storage form. This is the compound that circulates in your blood as a reservoir. And this one molecule at this one stage is what gets measured when your doctor orders a vitamin D blood test. The number on your lab report, whether it reads 14 nanograms per milliliter or 32 nanograms per milliliter, is your 25-OHD level. How much your liver has processed and banked. Here is the mainstream betrayal moment. Most commercial laboratories in the United States flag anything above 20 nanograms per milliliter as normal. Your result comes back at 22. It's marked normal. Your doctor glances at it, ticks the box, moves on. No adjustment, no conversation. You leave reassured. But the Endocrine Society, the largest professional organization of hormone specialists in the world, recommends a minimum of 30 nanograms per milliliter for basic adequacy and identifies 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter as the optimal target range for overall physiological function. The International Osteoporosis Foundation and several major cancer research bodies align closer to the Endocrine Society's threshold than to the standard lab cutoff. The 20 nanogram threshold was established based almost entirely on bone health, specifically the minimum level at which vitamin D is just sufficient to prevent rickets and osteomalacia, the severe bone-softening diseases that historically appeared in populations with extreme deprivation. That was the original research question in the 1970s. How much vitamin D does a human body need to keep bones from collapsing? It was never designed to define optimal function for the immune system, for cognitive tissue, for muscle fiber integrity, or for cardiovascular health. Those systems have different and higher demands, and the research establishing those demands came decades after the reference range was set. So your lab result says normal. What it is actually telling you is that you're probably not about to develop rickets. And that is a genuinely different statement from your immune cells are adequately supplied with the hormone they need to activate. Those are not the same thing. They never were. The reference range was written for one biological outcome and applied universally as though the body runs on a single system. It doesn't. I find this genuinely interesting in a slightly bleak way. We have a lab reference range built on preventing a disease that almost no one in the developed world gets anymore, and that number is still being used to evaluate a molecule that regulates T-cell activation, hippocampal neuroprotection, arterial calcium handling, and DNA repair mechanisms. The number wasn't wrong for its original purpose. It was simply never redesigned for its current one. Now, the second conversion, and this is where aging does its most consequential damage, in a place almost no one is looking. That stored form sitting in your liver, 25-OHD, still cannot do anything at the cellular level. It needs one more transformation to become the biologically active hormone. That transformation happens primarily in your kidneys and produces a compound called 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D, also known as calcitriol. This is the actual working form. This is the molecule that crosses into cells, enters the nucleus, binds to the vitamin D receptor, and changes which genes are being expressed. Without this final conversion, nothing downstream functions. All the sun exposure, all the supplements, all the stored form in your liver, none of it reaches your cells until the kidney refinery runs it through. Your kidney's capacity to perform this conversion declines steadily with age. By your mid-60s, kidney filtration capacity, measured as glomerular filtration rate, has typically dropped by 30 to 40% compared to your 30s. This is universally considered normal age-related decline. It rarely triggers clinical alarm. Most people never receive a single conversation about it, but the enzyme responsible for that final conversion of vitamin D, called 1-alpha hydroxylase, is tightly linked to kidney function. As the kidneys slow, enzyme output slows proportionally. Think of it this way: vitamin D3 from sunlight is crude oil coming out of the ground. Your liver is the first refinery. It processes the crude into a stable intermediate fuel that can be stored and transported through the bloodstream. Your kidneys are the second refinery. They crack that stored fuel into the final active form that actually powers the cellular engine. If your skin produces 75% less crude oil than it did at 30, and your kidneys refine what remains at 60% of their former capacity, the amount of active vitamin D hormone reaching your cells may be a small fraction of what it was 2 decades ago. And yet, the standard blood test, which only checks the midpoint of this four-stage pipeline, may return a number that the lab marks as perfectly acceptable. This is the invisible villain running through this entire story. Not poor diet, not failure to go outside. A two-stage biological conversion process that functioned adequately at 30 is systematically disrupted by 60. And the most commonly ordered blood test measures only one point in that pipeline at a threshold calibrated for a different disease in a different era. You could have adequate storage in your liver and still be starving at the cellular level, and the standard workup would never reveal it. Let me take you to where the actual damage is accumulating. Vitamin D receptors, called VDRs, have been identified in virtually every tissue in the human body. The heart muscle, the brain, the pancreatic beta cells that produce insulin, the T cells and B cells of the adaptive immune system, the smooth muscle lining your arteries, the neurons of the hippocampus, the skeletal muscle fibers that hold you upright. Researchers have confirmed VDR presence in more than 30 different tissue types. That distribution is not coincidental. Evolution doesn't build the same receptor into 30 different tissues for decorative purposes. This hormone is embedded in the organism's basic operating code. When sufficient active vitamin D cannot reach those receptors, which is what happens when skin synthesis fails and kidney conversion declines simultaneously, those 30-plus tissue types begin to malfunction in different ways, on different timelines, producing a collection of symptoms that are routinely attributed to aging because they appear gradually and have no obvious single cause. Begin with bones and muscles together, because they are more metabolically entwined than most people understand. The calcium story is the one people know. Without adequate vitamin D, your gut absorbs only 10 to 15% of dietary calcium. With adequate vitamin D, that absorption rate rises to 30 to 40%. That difference is the gap between calcium passing through your digestive system largely unused and calcium actually crossing the gut wall, entering circulation, and being available for skeletal maintenance and muscle function. Vitamin D is not an add-on to calcium metabolism, it is the gatekeeper. The door does not open without it. But here is the piece almost never mentioned in the mainstream coverage. Vitamin D receptors are located directly inside skeletal muscle cells. Not near them, inside them. The active hormone calcitriol binds to VDRs in muscle tissue and regulates protein synthesis, the speed of muscle fiber contraction, and the handling of calcium ions within the cell, which are the signals that initiate and coordinate muscle contraction itself. When those receptors are understimulated because the active hormone is not arriving in sufficient quantity, the result is a specific pattern of muscle weakness, proximal weakness, concentrated in the large muscles of the hips, thighs, and shoulders, the muscles you use to stand from a chair, to carry groceries up a flight of stairs, to catch yourself when you stumble. A meta-analysis published in Osteoporosis International found that vitamin D supplementation at 800 international units daily reduced fall rates in older adults by approximately 22%. Falls are the leading cause of fatal injury in adults over 65 in the United States. According to the CDC, approximately 36 million falls occur in that population annually, resulting in roughly 32,000 deaths per year. A 22% reduction from addressing one nutrient deficiency is not a minor footnote in a supplement conversation. That is a mortality scale finding hiding behind a blood test most doctors aren't ordering with any urgency. The muscle weakness is also self-reinforcing in a way that accelerates everything else. If rising from a chair is harder, you sit more. If you sit more, muscle mass declines further through disuse atrophy. If muscle mass declines, your resting metabolic rate drops. If your resting metabolic rate drops, insulin sensitivity worsens, visceral fat accumulates more easily, and the inflammatory burden on every other system increases. What looks like a straightforward getting older trajectory is in many cases a spiral initiated by a two-stage conversion failure that nobody identified and nobody corrected. Now, the cardiovascular layer, which gets almost no coverage in popular discussions about vitamin D receptors are present throughout cardiovascular tissue, in the cells lining your arteries, in the smooth muscle of arterial walls, and in the heart muscle itself. One of the mechanisms here involves the renin-angiotensin system, which is the hormonal cascade that regulates blood pressure by controlling how much your kidneys retain sodium and water. Vitamin D acts as a suppressor of renin production, the enzyme that kicks off this cascade. When vitamin D levels drop, renin production increases and blood pressure tends to rise. This is one of the proposed mechanisms behind the consistent association between vitamin D deficiency and hypertension found across large observational studies. More specifically, arterial stiffness, the loss of elasticity in blood vessel walls, that is a leading predictor of cardiovascular events, has been associated with vitamin D insufficiency across multiple studies. Arteries that should flex with each heartbeat become progressively more rigid, increasing the mechanical strain on the heart and elevating systolic blood pressure. This stiffening process is gradual, symptom-free until it isn't, and is typically attributed to generic aging rather than any correctable deficit. The VITAL trial, a large randomized controlled trial led by Joanne Manson at Harvard, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2019, tested 2,000 international units of vitamin D3 daily in over 25,000 adults. The primary cardiovascular endpoints were not significantly reduced overall, though cancer mortality dropped by 25% in certain subgroups, and the trial produced a number of secondary findings still being analyzed. What the VITAL trial tells us is not that vitamin D is irrelevant to cardiovascular health, but that correcting deficiency in an already supplemented, relatively healthy trial population may show different effects than what's happening in someone who has been running chronically deficient for 15 years without knowing it. The immune system layer is where the research has become impossible to ignore. Every T cell in your body carries a vitamin D receptor. But more than that, T cells cannot complete their activation sequence without it. When a naive T cell encounters a pathogen, the activation process requires vitamin D to upregulate the receptor that allows the cell to amplify its response and differentiate into the specialized fighter it needs to become. Without sufficient calcitriol, T cells detect the threat but cannot fully mobilize. They are soldiers who can see the enemy and cannot fully draw their weapons. A landmark meta-analysis published in the British Medical Journal in 2017, led by Adrian Martineau at Queen Mary University of London, drawing on data from 25 randomized controlled trials and nearly 11,000 participants, found that vitamin D supplementation significantly reduced the incidence of acute respiratory infections. Among participants who were deficient at study entry, the protective effect of supplementation was comparable to the protection conferred by injectable influenza vaccines. This was not a fringe finding in a low-quality journal. This was a rigorous meta-analysis in one of the most cited medical publications in the world. And here is the compounding problem. Immune function already declines with age through a separate, well-documented process called immunosenescence, the progressive deterioration of the immune system's speed and precision. The thymus shrinks, T-cell diversity narrows, inflammatory background noise increases. Adding vitamin D deficiency on top of immunosenescence doesn't simply add a second problem. The two processes interact, and the combination is more damaging than either alone. A system already operating with reduced accuracy becomes fundamentally less capable when the hormone that activates its primary responders is chronically undersupplied. Now the brain, and this is where the conversation becomes genuinely uncomfortable. The hippocampus, the brain region most critical for forming new memories and the first region to show measurable deterioration in Alzheimer's disease, is dense with vitamin D receptors. Calcitriol, once it crosses the blood-brain barrier, promotes the production of neurotrophins, which are proteins your brain relies on to protect existing neurons and support the creation of new synaptic connections. It also participates in regulating dopamine and serotonin, two neurotransmitters with well-documented roles in motivation, mood, and executive function. And it activates mechanisms that help clear amyloid beta, the protein fragments that accumulate in the plaques characteristic of Alzheimer's pathology. A 2014 study published in JAMA Neurology followed more than 1,600 adults over 6 years. Participants with severe vitamin D deficiency, defined as below 10 nanograms per milliliter, had more than double the risk of developing dementia and Alzheimer's disease compared to participants with sufficient levels. More striking, participants who were merely insufficient, levels between 10 and 20 nanograms per milliliter, which many labs would still flag as borderline normal, showed a 69% higher dementia risk compared to the sufficient group. 69% higher risk of dementia from levels your lab report might describe as almost acceptable, not catastrophically deficient, just chronically insufficient. Correlation and causation are different things, and I want to be precise. It is biologically plausible that people in early cognitive decline reduce outdoor activity and eat less varied diets, which then lowers vitamin D levels, the reverse direction from the one that makes vitamin D the cause. Good researchers acknowledge this as a legitimate limitation, but the VDR distribution in hippocampal tissue is not circumstantial. The neuroprotective pathways are biochemically documented. The consistent appearance of this relationship across multiple large longitudinal studies in multiple countries using multiple methodologies is not nothing. The sleep dimension is almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage and deserves its own layer. Vitamin D receptors are present in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the brain's master circadian clock, and in brainstem regions involved in sleep-wake transitions. A 2018 study found that participants with confirmed vitamin D deficiency who completed 12 weeks of supplementation showed significant improvements in sleep quality measured by validated assessment tools, specifically in sleep duration and sleep efficiency, which is the proportion of time in bed actually spent asleep. The researchers found improvements in sleep onset latency as well, meaning participants fell asleep more quickly. Persistent sleep disruption after 60 is almost universally framed as a natural consequence of aging. And some sleep architecture change is genuinely age-related, there is real biology behind it, but some of what presents as inevitable age-related sleep deterioration may be, at least in part, a vitamin D receptor problem embedded in the brain's timekeeping system, and it is being managed with melatonin supplements and acceptance rather than with a corrective approach to the underlying hormone deficit. Now I want to take you to the layer that is almost never discussed in any popular coverage, and this is arguably the most important information in this entire script for anyone who is already supplementing with vitamin D and not seeing meaningful results. Vitamin D does not work alone. It is part of a metabolic system that requires two additional nutrients to function at every stage of the pipeline. Without them, taking vitamin D supplements may produce genuinely minimal benefit, and in one specific case may actively create a new problem. The first missing piece is magnesium. Every enzymatic conversion in the vitamin D pipeline requires magnesium as a cofactor. The liver enzyme that converts raw D3 into the storage form uses magnesium. The kidney enzyme that converts the storage form into active calcitriol uses magnesium. The vitamin D binding protein that transports these molecules through the bloodstream depends on magnesium-dependent processes. Magnesium is not an optional bonus ingredient in this system. It is a structural requirement at multiple stages. According to Hanish Hayen's survey data, approximately 48% of Americans consume less magnesium than the estimated average requirement. Among adults over 60, poor magnesium absorption from the gut, driven partly by reduced stomach acid production that accompanies aging and partly by increased urinary magnesium loss, compounds the dietary shortfall. The result is that close to half of people taking vitamin D supplements may be supplementing into a magnesium-depleted system. The raw material enters the pipeline. The enzymes that refine it are operating at reduced capacity because the catalyst is missing. Your blood test may show the storage form increasing because that first liver conversion can partially proceed, but the final kidney conversion into active calcitriol may remain insufficient. A 2018 review published in the Journal of the American Osteopathic Association examined the available evidence and concluded explicitly that without sufficient magnesium, vitamin D remains largely stored and inactive, and that this metabolic dependency is broadly ignored in both clinical practice and public health guidance. The authors argued that optimizing magnesium status may be as important as vitamin D intake itself for addressing the underlying deficiency. You can take the supplement, the pipeline can remain broken, the number on the test can go up, and your cells can remain undersupplied. The second missing cofactor is vitamin K2, and this one has a specific safety dimension that matters for anyone combining vitamin D with calcium supplementation. One of vitamin D's primary actions is to dramatically increase calcium absorption from the gut. That is the core mechanism behind its role in bone health. But calcium entering the bloodstream needs to be directed somewhere. It needs to go to bone matrix and teeth, and it needs to be actively prevented from depositing in the walls of arteries and soft tissue. Vitamin K2, specifically the form called MK7, performs both functions by activating two proteins: osteocalcin, which binds calcium and deposits it into bone, and matrix GLA protein, which sweeps calcium away from arterial walls and prevents calcification. Without adequate K2, the calcium that vitamin D is driving into circulation has no biological routing system. The Rotterdam study, which followed nearly 5,000 adults for a decade, found that participants with the highest dietary K2 intake had a 52% lower risk of severe aortic calcification, a 57% lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease, and a 26% lower risk of all-cause mortality. Research published in Thrombosis and Hemostasis has linked inadequate K2 status directly to arterial calcification in mechanisms that operate independently of total calcium intake. This is the calcium paradox. You take vitamin D, you eat calcium, or take a calcium supplement. You believe you are building bone, but without K2 directing calcium into skeletal tissue and actively clearing it from arterial walls, you may be reinforcing a cardiovascular liability while solving a bone problem. It is not a theoretical risk. The routing mechanism is real, and the consequence of missing it is real. Anyone taking vitamin D and calcium together without K2 is making a partial correction at best. There is also a body composition variable that changes the entire dosing conversation and that almost no supplementation guidance accounts for. Vitamin D is fat-soluble. It is stored in adipose tissue, fat cells, throughout the body. The more fat tissue you carry, the more supplemental or sun-derived vitamin D gets sequestered in that tissue, held there, and unavailable to the organs and immune and neurological systems that need it. A 2011 study in the journal Obesity found that adults with obesity required approximately 2 to 3 times the dose of vitamin D supplementation to achieve the same serum level increase as normal weight adults given an identical dose. The supplement isn't failing. It's being absorbed and immediately stored in a depot that doesn't release it efficiently into active circulation. This has a counterintuitive implication. When people lose significant amounts of body fat, stored vitamin D gets released back into circulation, and serum levels can rise without any increase in supplementation. The vitamin wasn't created by the weight loss. It was liberated from a reservoir where it had been sitting uselessly, sequestered away from the tissues that needed it for years, and there is a dimension that mainstream vitamin D messaging almost never addresses directly: melanin. Melanin, the pigment responsible for darker skin tones, functions as a natural UV filter. It dramatically reduces the risk of UV-related DNA damage and skin cancer, an evolutionary adaptation that made profound sense in high UV equatorial environments. But it also substantially reduces the skin's capacity to synthesize vitamin D from sunlight, because the same UVB radiation that the melanin is blocking is the radiation required for D3 synthesis. Research consistently finds that Black Americans have substantially higher rates of vitamin D deficiency than white Americans, not due to dietary differences but to this melanin-mediated reduction in synthesis efficiency. A national survey found that close to 82% of Black adults in the United States had vitamin D levels below the Endocrine Society's optimal range. This is a biological reality that is almost entirely absent from standard public health messaging, which continues to recommend sun exposure as though the same advice produces equivalent outcomes across all populations. Here is where I want to pause for a moment because I know how this goes. You absorb a script's worth of information, it feels urgent, you think about it for 2 days, and then it goes the way of every other good intention. I did this for years. My husband had actually mapped all of this out: the testing sequence, the cofactor timing, the dosing logic, the phase structure, into a 30-day daily companion called the Noon Reset Protocol. He built it partly because watching me bookmark study after study and change nothing was genuinely difficult for him. I had the information, I just didn't have anything that turned information into a daily habit. The personal failure angle here is real. I had read almost everything I just told you, and I still wasn't doing it systematically. He knew what day 4 of any new protocol feels like. It's the day the initial motivation runs out and nothing has replaced it. And he built the structure so that that wall has a handrail on it. 2 pages per day, 1 page of the science context for what you're doing and why, 1 page of tracker. 4 phases across 30 days: adaptation, activation, optimization, acceleration. Each phase is designed around what's actually happening physiologically in that window. Because your body's response to nutritional correction isn't flat, the first week looks completely different from week 3, and treating them the same leaves most of the benefit unrealized. He also built in 25 breakfast meal ideas with exact protein counts, which solved a specific problem for me. I never knew what to eat to accompany fat-soluble supplements correctly, and with an eating window that opens around noon, that first meal is doing a lot of metabolic work. You can get it through the link in the description for less than a restaurant meal. I'm mildly embarrassed it took me as long as it did to actually use what was sitting right there. Now, let me close with the solar debt protocol, because this is the piece that turns everything I've described from a set of alarming facts into something you can act on this week. The concept of solar debt is the frame I want you to carry out of this video. Your body built vitamin D stores across decades of sun exposure. The stores you accumulated in your 30s and 40s supported biological functions you relied on throughout your 50s. But the skin synthesis decline that begins in your late 30s means you have been producing progressively less with each passing year, silently, without a symptom. By the time the consequences appear, the muscle weakness, the frequent respiratory infections, the sleep disruption, the cognitive fog, the persistent fatigue, the deficit may have been compounding for 15 or 20 years. Studies suggest that restoring vitamin D levels from deficient to optimal takes between 3 and 6 months of consistent, correctly supported supplementation, because you are not filling a daily requirement. You are replenishing a reservoir that has been quietly emptying since before you noticed anything was wrong. The Solar Debt Protocol has 3 components. Component 1 is pipeline repair. Supplement with vitamin D3 specifically, not D2. The D3 form is bioidentical to what your skin produces and consistently shows greater efficacy at raising serum levels. For adults over 60, the Endocrine Society suggests therapeutic doses between 1,500 and 2,000 international units daily for maintenance. Ask your doctor for a 25 OAG blood test. You may need to request this specifically, as the United States Preventive Services Task Force does not currently recommend routine vitamin D screening for average-risk adults, which means it is often not ordered unless prompted. Use 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter as your personal target range, not the 20 nanogram floor that your lab marks as the lower limit of normal. Retest at 3 months. Do not supplement at very high doses without testing and medical supervision. Vitamin D toxicity is real at sustained excessive doses and requires monitoring. Component 2 is the cofactor stack. Take vitamin D3 together with magnesium glycinate, the form with highest absorption and lowest risk of digestive side effects, at a target of 300 to 400 milligrams of elemental magnesium daily. Add vitamin K2 in the MK7 form at a minimum of 100 micrograms daily. Critically, take both fat-soluble vitamins, D3 and K2, with your largest meal. Research shows that taking vitamin D with a meal containing dietary fat increases absorption by approximately 50% compared to taking it on an empty stomach. If your eating window opens around noon, that first full meal is physiologically ideal timing for these supplements. The fat in your breakfast meal drives the absorption of both fat-soluble compounds directly. Component 3 is the solar debt audit. Every 3 months for the first year, run a complete panel, 25 OATD for the primary metric, red blood cell magnesium, not serum magnesium, which is a notoriously poor indicator of tissue magnesium stores and can appear normal even when you are genuinely deficient, and parathyroid hormone, which rises as a compensatory response when vitamin D is insufficient and gives you a second independent signal about your true status that your D level alone may miss. Once your 25 OAD has been stable in the 40 to 60 range for 2 consecutive quarterly tests, drop to twice yearly monitoring. The one mistake that invalidates this entire protocol is taking fat-soluble vitamins without dietary fat. Vitamin D3 and K2 require fat present in the gut for absorption. Taken with a glass of water and a piece of fruit in the morning, absorption falls by 30 to 50% according to multiple pharmacokinetic studies. Millions of people supplement consistently for months, wonder why their levels don't improve, and conclude the supplements are ineffective. The supplements are fine. The delivery vehicle is wrong. Take them with food that contains real fat. This is not optional biochemistry. It is the absorption mechanism. Here is the frame I want to leave you with because I think the frame actually changes behavior in a way that a list of dosing instructions does not. The story you have been handed about vitamin D is a genuinely impressive example of how incomplete public health guidance can produce population-wide deficiency without anyone lying to anyone. The messaging, go outside, eat fortified foods, take a supplement if your doctor tells you to, was built when vitamin D was understood primarily as a calcium regulator for bones. We now have decades of research documenting VDR presence in over 30 tissue types, confirming roles in T-cell activation, hippocampal neuroprotection, arterial calcium handling, sleep architecture, insulin sensitivity, and DNA repair processes. The public guidance has not caught up with the research. It rarely does. The lag between evidence and policy is typically measured in decades. Your doctor is not concealing this. In most cases, they are operating within a system that set a reference range based on bone disease research from the 1970s and has not made correcting a hormone deficiency a clinical priority when it doesn't produce an obvious, immediate, and billable acute presentation. The result is that a substantial majority of adults over 60, some estimates using the Endocrine Society threshold place it at over 70%, are running below optimal on a hormone that touches virtually every system in the body, experiencing what they describe as general decline, and receiving the reassurance that their numbers are fine. That is not a conspiracy. It is the entirely predictable output of a system that rewards treating documented disease rather than preventing the slow compounding insults that create it. I find it less enraging than genuinely fascinating, the same way you find yourself fascinated when something that should have been fixed decades ago just wasn't. Nobody's villain, just incentives pointing in the wrong direction for a very long time, while a 4-stage biological pipeline quietly failed in millions of aging bodies. The correction is not complicated. It is a blood test, a 3-component protocol, and a bit of dietary fat at the right moment. If you are starting the Solar Debt protocol this week, comment Solar Debt below so I can see who is actually following through on this one. And subscribe, because the next video covers something that connects directly to the kidney conversion failure I described today, and watching both back to back will make everything here significantly more actionable.